mention a couple of things. Last night, there was a hobo who showed up here that looked a little bit like me, but he was ugly. And yes, beautiful lady, but he was willing to work. I can see why. Steve mentioned something about lecturing. I don't like to lecture. In fact, when I taught at York College, I thought that I was conducting discussions. And one day, after what I thought was a very good class, and I was saying to myself, this was one of the best discussions we've ever had, because what I would do is go into the classroom and start asking questions. And so there was a give and take all the way through, and by the time we got through, I was through with my lesson. I knew what was going to come up. They didn't necessarily. And so I thought, oh, this was such a good discussion, one of the best discussions I've ever led. And a girl came up to me and she said, I really enjoyed the lecture today. Can't wait. We saw this yesterday. Now, finally, Congress passed the Soil Conservation Act in April 1935. A lot of trees were planted. Actually, it was supposed to be around 200 million trees planted throughout the Dust Bowl area, and a lot of these were planted in Nebraska. I don't know if any of you have noticed. I noticed as we were driving in last Saturday, several places of approximately a quarter of a mile or so of trees that were, and those trees, even though they're not very large, they were planted there a long time ago. And most of the trees have been removed. I remember when we were here, any of you remember Fern Rose? Okay, there were a few of us who could remember. She wrote an item in the newspaper called Rambling with Rose. And what she did was drive out all in the area all over and find something of interest and write about it. One time she wrote about the trees that were too close to the highway between here and wherever going west. And she was afraid that these trees were going to cause accidents. Of course, when the trees were put there, probably the main travel speed was something like 25 or 30. And then, of course, we were traveling 60 and 70, and some people even more than that. I remember one student, well, I won't get into that. But Franklin Roosevelt also established what was called the Resettlement Administration, and he signed the Executive Order 7028, allowing federal authorities to buy back the homesteads that people had gotten. To many people, it looked like this was a plan of deportation. It looked like they wanted to get people out of this area and out of all of the plains area. You remember some of the earlier accounts when people traveled through the plains area, they said no white man will ever live here. A white man cannot make a living here, and so forth. I want you to keep that in mind. But as a result of that, the movement to stay grew. There were a lot of people who were saying, maybe we need to get out of here. Maybe all this is being blown away. Maybe. And so finally, they decided maybe we ought to stay. The government's trying to get us to leave. Therefore, you know, that situation. There were model cities that were set up. There's a picture of one. But they were called model cities of the future. They were planned, but very little was done to complete them. Congress didn't appropriate enough money, and they had planned to move 650,000 people into these cities, out of the country, the farming, and only about 9% of the program was completed. Some of you saw this picture the other day in another class. Ernie Pyle wrote descriptive articles about what was going on during the Dust Bowl. Most of us may remember him more for his writings and his death in World War II. He was a war casualty. He was right with the troops all the time and sending back good articles about what was going on. And he was shot by the Japanese. But in the summer of 1936, Ernie Pyle wrote that the Dust Bowl, he called it this withering land of misery. And he wrote that it was the saddest land I've ever seen. So some of you have done a little thinking about the Dust Bowl. I'm glad I didn't have to live through it. Although more area was affected, this is a map that shows the main section. It's a little blurred. I couldn't get a better one. But it included part of Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Colorado, Kansas, and Nebraska. The heart of it was Boise City, Oklahoma, in Cimarron County, in the Panhandle. Picture Oklahoma on the map. Of course, those of you who are from Oklahoma can picture it easily enough. The Panhandle, if I understand correctly, the entire Panhandle is Cimarron County.
There's 3 counties.
There are 3 counties, okay. The part that Boise City is Cimarron County.
Yes.
And there are several other cities that are nearby that were affected greatly by it. For example, Guymon, Oklahoma, close by. Dalhart, Texas. Even I've been there. The great XIT city. But the latest population of Boise City that I could find was about 1,200, a little over 1,200 people. I saw this picture of this little boy years ago, and I thought, how pathetic to have to rear children in an area where they couldn't breathe properly. We've already talked about the diseases and so forth. The main causes of the depression, excuse me, I'm sorry, of the Dust Bowl. There was a lot of cattle grazing. When you have that kind of grass, you need cattle, right? And so cattle were brought in, and you remember what the farmers were saying. Farmers were saying, get out, we don't need you. But cattle grazing took much of the grass that held the land together. Then, of course, the plowing of the sod. The sod had kept the plains area protected for so many years. And there was an attempt to grow more grain. This was mentioned in the class, in the afternoon class. But, like, there was so much needed. And the In World War I, for example, we had to supply a lot of people all over the world with food. And so, plow up the land. I've seen pictures of tractors pulling plows that were about as wide as this room. Just speeding up and down, and I saw a picture of one field in which there were 5 tractors pulling plows about this wide. There was really a bunch of plows grouped together. And they were plowing up the sod because they wanted to plant more wheat. Plant more wheat. And so one man said, God didn't create this land to be plowed. And that was a general opinion of many of the people who had grown up there. But people came from outside and bought up hundreds and hundreds of acres and plowed and plowed and plowed. One interesting sidelight here, I think. The Farmall tractor was produced by International Harvester beginning in 1924. In 1936, they changed the color. It had been a deep blue-gray with red wheels. Some of you probably have seen some of those old ones. Well, in 1936, they changed it to what they called Farmall Red. And so it was a red tractor, everything red for a long time. And people could, from a distance, see, oh, that's a Farmall tractor. You wouldn't have to see the details. You just see the color. There it is. The most famous F-Series lasted until 1939, and then the color remained until just recent years. I remember, and this is just a few years ago, when they started, I believe they started painting most of them green a few years ago, and I was sad about that. I like Farmall red. But anyway.
John Deere green.
In an area that was basically dry to begin with, not a great rainfall, there came a serious drought. The natives always called it drought. I saw this, not only hearing it, but I saw this in a lot of the writings. They even spelled it with a TH on the end. Many people lost their farms. You might look at this and say, what farm? The picture was taken in Dallas, South Dakota. Sometimes I like to analyze things. I think I can sit and look at this picture for 30 minutes and find something new about it. Every few minutes. This is awful. But anyway, many people, because of this, decided to leave. Most of them went to California. No matter where they were from, they were called Okies. You remember the song Dear Okie? How many of you remember the song Dear Okie? Dear Okie, if you see Archie, tell him Tex got a job for him out in California. Picking up prunes, squeezing oil out of olives. I don't know if Woody Guthrie wrote that. He should have. It was about his speed. But I had a great aunt, Aunt Ann, who lived in Los Angeles, California. When I went to Pepperdine that one year, I lived with one of her sons. She didn't like the word Okie. She said, I am an Oklahomian. And of course my dad was an Oklahomian also. He never did say that. He didn't mind being called Okie or anything else. Didn't matter to him. But they came or went, came because because I'm from there, so I think of coming. But anyway, they went to California before the Dust Bowl. They were out there in the early 1920s. And so they were not a part of that Okie movement. And so she resented it very much. But anyway, many of these people who went to California became migratory workers. They would pick cotton in one place. When the cotton was all picked, they'd move to another place and pick some kind of fruit. When that one gave out, they would move to another place and pick something else. Many of them lived in camps. I grew up on a farm that was 3.5 sections of land. That's 3.5 square miles. And we had a camp. That's all we called it, the camp. I think it had about 20 cabins in it, one-room cabins. Anybody that came to work there, anybody who came to pick cotton could live there in the camp. When the camp was full, then they had to find their own place to live. And so many of them did that. Many people who went to California during that time lived in their cars or lived in a little lean-to that they set up next to their cars. So this leads us to a very important subject to me, Route 66. It became the main highway for the Okies. And this picture, which you will see over and over, I've talked about it before, but this lady was 32 years old. She had 6 children. And if you look at, well, it's kind of hard to think about this. Route 66, 2,451 miles from Chicago to Los Angeles. Jeanette and I have traveled probably, well, almost 2,400 miles of that 2,451. There's a section between Lancaster and Los Angeles that we have not been on. And it probably doesn't even exist now, but all the rest of it we've traveled on. And we're proud of it. It became the first U.S. highway to be totally paved, and that was completed in 1938. The first advertisement by the United States Highway 66 Association was on July 16, 1932, in the Saturday Evening Post. It was inviting people to take Route 66 to the 1932 Summer Olympics in Los Angeles. Several places along the old route have been restored. There's a U-drop in Shamrock, east of Amarillo, Texas. It was built in 1936. It's an Art Deco type building. The halfway mark is on 6th Street in Amarillo. Our granddaughter lives in Amarillo, and she married a guy from Amarillo, and I asked him, "Are you acquainted with 6th Street?" Of course he was. I said, "There's a building there that has a sign on it." He said, "I've seen that." So anyway, there it is. Road does not end here. There's a nice little place in Cool Springs, Arizona that was built in the 1930s and was part of the movement. In Grapes of Wrath, John Steinbeck called Route 66 the Mother Road. I want to read a little bit. This is just a short part of the sentence. He said, and this is in the Grapes of Wrath, so this is not history. And they come into 66 from the tributary side roads, from the wagon tracks and the rutted county roads. 66 is the mother road, the road of flight. This is a picture of Okies entering into California. This is right on the border, just as they got to California. In Dalhart, Texas, they gave people who were leaving 10 gallons of gasoline and a used tire. I think of that used tire business. I remember one time we were going through the panhandle of Texas many years ago. We were pulling a trailer, and guess what I was looking for in the panhandle of Texas? A used tire, because I wanted to have one of those, the extra one in case something happened to our worn out tires that we had on the trailer. We found one. Can't remember the name of that city, but anyway, doesn't really matter. It's sometimes called the Will Rogers Highway, but not officially. It was pushed by the U.S. Highway 66 Association, but it never did happen. This is a Phillips 66 service station in 1930. In 1930, this is the logo that they started using for their gasoline.
Wasn't that color?
Excuse me?
It wasn't that color. It was all orange.
It was orange, that one.
They were testing a new gasoline, driving along on Route 66 in Oklahoma. They discovered they were going 66 miles an hour. That was pretty fast at the time. So they decided to call their fuel Phillips 66, and this logo is a shield, just like the highway sign. And so all of that kind of fits together. I remember in our many travels, even before we got married, we would travel a lot on Highway 66, going to California and back to Arkansas and so forth. And Phillips 66 stations everywhere. The highway was made famous by this song. Get your kicks on Route 66, usually just called Route 66. It was written by Bobby Troup in 1946, and that same year it was recorded by Nat King Cole. This picture, by the way, was taken in the 1930s when he was still a teenager. He made his first recording when he was a teenager. He formed his King Cole trio when he was a teenager. He got married when he was a teenager. There were a lot of things that Nat King Cole did when he was a teenager. When they performed, he always wore a crown because it was Nat King Cole. And so anyway, since he recorded this song, 52 other groups or individuals have made inferior recordings of that song. Before Jeanette and I ever met, this is extra. You don't have to pay anything for this. Before we ever met, each one of us had a favorite singer, Nat King Cole. We didn't even discover that we liked the same singer the best until we were in Green Bay, Wisconsin years later, a couple of years later, after we married, and he came on television. Oh, Nat King Cole, oh good, he's my favorite singer. That was stereo. I could stay on that for the next year, but I made a real big study of Nat King Cole, but we don't have time for that right now. Opposition to Franklin Roosevelt. There was a lot of it There was the usual political party opposition, but that's normal. But there's a lot of serious ideological opposition to his programs. Dr. Francis Everett Townsend, born in 1867, died in 1960. He got a degree, his medical degree, from Omaha Medical College in 1903. Steve mentioned this morning that sometimes students take issue with what somebody says because they check it on their smartphones while the teacher is teaching. I have found that there is a lot of conflicting material found online. So if you want to take issue with what I just said about the Omaha Medical College, I found one source that said that he got his degree from the University of Nebraska. Now, there's a possibility that there was a connection between the two at the time. I don't know. But he practiced medicine in South Dakota, where he met his wife. She was a nurse. They married. They eventually settled in Long Beach, California in 1919. This is a picture of Dr. Townsend on the left. Excuse me. I'm looking at it in the wrong way. He's on the right. The man on the left is Senator Sheridan Downing of California. Dr. Townsend did most of his work in California. He came up with the Townsend plan. We know why he called it that. It called for a pension of $2,200 per month for any citizen over 60 years of age. $200 a month. It all must be spent within the month, according to that program. The average state old age assistance at that time was $20 a month. And most people thought $40 a month would be real good. So $200 a month was very good. Funds would be raised by a 2% federal state sales tax. Several benefits were promised according to this plan that we'll not get into, but David Kennedy wrote, it seemed too good to be true. It was. That's what he wrote about it. There were several bills that were introduced into Congress. They were all defeated. And after 1935, when it appeared that the economy was recovering, he just faded out. The Social Security Act was passed, and that was the end of that. Now here's the guy who gave Franklin Roosevelt fits.
Joe?
Governor of Alabama, excuse me, Louisiana. I don't know why. He was a United States Senator. He supported the election of FDR, but soon he broke with him because he realized the president was not going to introduce his Share Our Wealth program. Long was against wealth, but he was rich. He was against Wall Street, but he made all kinds of money. He was for, this is from him, he was for the excellency of the common man. He wanted to cure their tribulations. He was FDR's main opposition from the left. He said, whenever this administration has gone to the left, I have voted with it. This is when he was senator. And whenever it has gone to the right, I have voted against it. I don't know, he should have used wrong and right. Probably, I'm not sure. David Kennedy wrote, "Long strutted across the national stage full of sound and fury." He was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1930, but he remained as governor of Louisiana until June of 1933. So he was both governor and senator at the same time. As governor in the 1920s, he was more like being a dictator than any person in the United States ever. There was a book written, some of you might remember this, The Long, Long Dilemma. I don't remember the man who wrote that book. Roosevelt said that he was one of the two most dangerous men in the United States. He called him a radical demagogue, but he and Douglas MacArthur, General Douglas MacArthur, were the two most dangerous men in America. MacArthur was U.S. Army Chief of Staff during the 1930s. Roosevelt sent him as military advisor to the Philippines in 1935. A man by the name of Mark Perry wrote later, "The Most Dangerous Man in America," about MacArthur. This is, by the way, not what I remember about him. Claiming that he flouted, overused his military authority. FDR compared Long to Hitler and Mussolini. Other senators also disliked his methods, and not one of his bills or resolutions or motions ever passed while he was senator from 1933 to 1935. During one debate, a senator told Long, "I do not believe you could get the Lord's Prayer passed in this body." Oh, before we get to this, Sinclair Lewis used Long and a priest by the name of Coughlin, we'll talk about him later, as examples to write the novel It Can't Happen Here. When I was at York College, I reviewed that book one time before a group of people. But the Share Our Wealth program that he introduced in 1934, it was to limit the personal fortunes by taxation. The taxes then would be distributed. $5,000 to every family in the United States. You know what they were to do with it? They were to buy a home, they were to buy a car, and they were to buy a radio. A home, a car, and a radio. And then they were to be supplied an annual income of $2,500. Included in this plan were free primary and college education, an old age pension, veterans benefits, assistance to farmers, public works projects, a 30-hour work week. He had everything planned. This was going to be a perfect nation, perfect place to live. Long said that his program was not socialistic. Not at all. It was from the Bible, and it was from the Declaration of Independence. There are a lot of people who have thought that the Declaration of Independence is part of our laws. Simply a declaration. But anyway, we'll not get into that part. He said that his program was the only program issued in the United States that would save the nation from revolution and from communism. And by the way, I think probably you probably remember there was a great movement toward communism in the United States during the 1930s. And Woody Guthrie was just one of the examples that you could read about. Some have said that Long's ideas caused Franklin Roosevelt to turn to the left with the Second New Deal in 1935. It included the Works Progress Administration and Social Security. Roosevelt admitted that he was trying to steal Long's thunder. That's the terminology that he used. If I could steal Long's thunder, then we could get rid of him. We wouldn't have to listen to him anymore. Long continued to control Louisiana. Governor Oscar K. Allen followed everything that Long would say. When Long said, do this, that's what the governor did. He was the key stooge in the political machine of Huey Pierce Long Jr. This of course, is in that famous encyclopedia that you can get online. And by the way, you can get a lot of false information on that encyclopedia, but it has a lot of good information too. And so we have to be very careful about it. It's sort of like reading commentaries on the Bible. You get a lot of good information and otherwise. Every time Long went back to Louisiana, he would take over the governor's office. The governor was shifted to another room, and he would take over the office and use the same old chair and so forth. Long's long-range plans. That's a good play on words, I think. He decided that it would be a good idea to split the Democratic Party in 1936 and get a Republican elected to the presidency. Doesn't sound like a Democrat working, does it? But he had long-range plans. Then, after getting a Republican elected, he would get a lot of good publicity. I can't imagine Long getting good publicity. But anyway, he couldn't win the election in 1936. He didn't have enough, but he would get himself elected in 1940. That would be after Roosevelt, of course, lost earlier. He was attracting attention from everybody, all over the world. Best laid plans of mice and men. I remember hearing about that sometime. But on September 8, 1935, Long was assassinated. Dr. Carl A. Weiss was shot 30 times by bodyguards and police. This is the last picture taken of Dr. Weiss. But there is a theory that was going around then, and I don't know if anybody ever thinks about it anymore. Weiss, it is thought, was unarmed, and he walked up to Long and in some way hit him, and I don't know if the theory says that it was to get his attention or what. But the bodyguards thought that he was going to shoot Long, and so they filled Weiss full of bullets, but one of the bullets got Huey Long. And of course, I don't know, it's an interesting theory. We'll never know if it was true or not, because when an accident like this happens, a gun can be planted on the person that's accused of the assassination. Here's something that I think, this is the last thing that we'll have before our intermission. But Long's funeral was conducted by Gerald L. K. Smith. Any of you ever hear of him? Come on, he wrote some very good stuff. When I was at York College years ago, I first became acquainted with this man. He wrote some very good information about the Church of the Lord. Total description of the church and so forth. He was a preacher for the disciples of Christ. And I remember that the only difference between what he believed and what the church at that time believed, the only difference was instrumental music. And he wrote some very good stuff. But anyway, he was called, and this is awful, he was called the Minister of Hate, because during the time Long was going around talking about what ought to be done, Gerald Smith was going around talking about Franklin Roosevelt in hateful ways, doing all kinds of things that any Christian ought not to do, in my opinion. And so what he said was that Long was assassinated. He said this in his funeral oration. Long was assassinated by the Roosevelt gang, supported by the New York Jew machine. That was his way of saying how the assassination took place. We're going to come to this man after we have a little time to rest, and to drink coffee, and to eat some food. Thank you very much. Charles Coffin, one of the great oppositions to Franklin Roosevelt's program. He's sometimes called the radio priest. He started his radio program after the Ku Klux Klan burned crosses on church grounds in 1926. Some of you may or may not have noticed down the stairs the displays from the local newspaper. In 1931, there was a meeting of the Ku Klux Klan in York, Nebraska. We're not proud of that. I wasn't here in 1931. I wasn't anywhere in 1931. That's awful. His broadcasts were local for a while, and always on religious subjects until the Depression. And beginning in January 1930, he went national on CBS, and his messages were dominated by political subjects. And he started his attacks on communism and on socialism. He attacked capitalists because he said they provided fertile soil for the spread of leftist ideology, and because of their greed. He also attacked Hoover and the banking system and the gold standard, just about anything else that you could imagine. He first supported FDR's policies, but then he turned against them. In 1931, CBS dropped him because he was so violently against the president, the system, not against the president. He raised enough money to create his own national network of 36 stations. And in 1932, he supported FDR. He used statements like this: Roosevelt or ruin. The New Deal is Christ's deal. He even started dropping into the White House unannounced. I'm not going to quote Franklin Roosevelt on this. There were several quotes I came across. In January 1934, he testified before Congress supporting Franklin Roosevelt's policies, and he stated, "If Congress fails to back up the president in his monetary program, I predict a revolution in this country which will make the French Revolution look silly." Oh, now, if you're acquainted with French Revolution, you know that would have been awful. He also said, "God is directing President Roosevelt." In 1934, he was receiving more mail than any person in the United States, including the president. Later in 1934, he turned against Roosevelt's monetary policies. He thought Roosevelt was moving too slowly. He proposed a new party, National Union for Social Justice. It had a potential for millions of people. If he could have united, and you may know some of these men, if he could have united Townsend, Sinclair, Olson, the La Follettes, Huey Long, if he could have united them, Kennedy said, there's no telling what disruptive furies might have been unleashed. But in 1935, this is a statement that Coughlin made. "I have dedicated my life to fight against the heinous rottenness of modern capitalism because it robs the labor of this world's goods. But blow by blow I shall strike against communism because it robs us of the next world's happiness." So he didn't like either thing. He had his own plans. He became a leader of the America First movement. It's either the United States or Hitler. Which do you choose? It wasn't a matter of associating with all the world and getting the good that we can get from associations from these nations, but it's either the United States or Hitler. Who are you going to choose? Well, that makes it simple, doesn't it? So we can easily make a decision like that. He was strongly opposed to Jews, even though he claimed he was not anti-Semitic. After 1936, he increasingly showed sympathy for fascist governments. He said that they were the only ones who could save the United States. Get that? Fascists were the only ones who could save the United States. Leading Catholics started opposing him, and this apparently gave the United States government, or at least government leaders, the courage to do something. So they said the First Amendment doesn't apply to freedom of speech on the radio. After greater and greater restrictions, they finally forced him off the air in 1940, ending the most powerful influence against Franklin Roosevelt's programs. He was also a powerful voice against capitalism. He was a powerful voice against self-protection against the fascists. And he was a powerful voice against our general way of life. Does the First Amendment apply to radio? My question simply was, why not? Another opposition against Franklin Roosevelt was Upton Sinclair. Extreme leftist. I don't know if he ever called himself a communist or not, but he was extremely to the left. Many began to think that communism was the only solution to the Depression. So that gave him a great audience. He wrote against organized religion. He said that every church was a mighty fortress of graft. He wrote that in The Prophets of Religion in 1918. He was a socialist muckraker. You remember the term muckraker? These were journalists who wrote bad things about anything and everything that came along. And the term came from the idea of taking a rake and raking it through the muck. That's it, slimy stuff, you know. Bad term to apply to anybody. He ran for governor of California in 1934 as a Democrat. His movement was called EPIC, End Poverty in California. Part of his program called for the state to take over idle land and turn it over to farmers' cooperatives, and take over idle factories and turn them over to workers' cooperatives. This would drive private industry out of business, he hoped, and it would end capitalism, bring in what he called the cooperative commonwealth. The motion picture industry, led by Louis Mayer of MGM, faked scenes of people, ugly-looking bums, coming to California, arriving there by the carload to enjoy all the freeloading possibilities. When asked why they had come to California in these fake newsreels, one said, Sinclair says he'll take the property of working people and give it to us. You know how that would go over. Anyway, these newsreels helped to defeat him in 1934. He was greatly misrepresented. I'm glad that he was not elected and so forth, but I hate to see people misrepresented. He met Roosevelt in September of 1934, had some friendly discussions with him. Later, Roosevelt referred to him, his proposals, as lunatic proposals. He wrote a lot of books. One place I read said he wrote 29 books in the 1930s. One said he wrote 30 books in the 1930s. I don't know, one or the other or both. One was titled, I, Governor of California, and How I Ended Poverty. That was a book that he wrote before the election. Later, he wrote a book, I, Candidate for Governor, and How I Got Licked. So he wrote about everything. This was much later. I thought I'd throw this in just simply to show. He wrote a lot of books.
Wow.
This is only 79 of them. I don't know how they got stacked together. Carefully, that's good. Come to this in just a moment. You know, the color, I want to make a comment about the background of all these slides. They're called slides, but they're really not, that I've been showing. I tried to pick a background that would illustrate something about what we're talking about, and they don't show up. They do on the computer very well, but they don't show up well. This one does, I'm glad. But we'll get to that. There are a lot of other movements. Let's take a look here first of all. A lot of other movements that were in opposition to Franklin Roosevelt: the Progressive Party, the Socialist Party, the Communist Party. It was easy to blame capitalism for anything. You know, if something goes wrong, who do you blame? When I was at York College, there were a lot of students who were blaming the college for things that the college had nothing to do about. That's a common thing, isn't it? Who do you blame for problems in the congregation?
Global warming.
Global warming. I'm gonna remember that.
Did that come from where I thought it did? Anyway, anything that you dislike, you can blame capitalism. Many of the young thought that the Depression was proof that capitalism was doomed, and that it was on the decline. Communism was coming up and would take its place. Earl Browder, the man on the left, was the chairman of the Communist Party USA from 1929 to 1944. So during all of the 1930s, he was candidate for president a number of times. But in 1944, he did something that disappointed Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin wasn't a citizen of the United States, but he controlled a lot of people here. And he got rid of Browder. So that was the end of that particular movement. But anyway, there were a lot of people who were in opposition to Franklin Roosevelt's policies. Now, from this point on, the rest of today's session and on Friday, we're going to talk primarily, I'm going to talk primarily, and you're going to listen, I hope, primarily, about cultural things in the United States. I say this until last. There are so many things that were going on during that time. For example, religion in the 1930s. One of the things that I would have thought differently than happened, I would have thought that attendance would go up. But during the 1930s, generally, attendance went down. And there are two exceptions. And there's reason for these two exceptions. Pentecostal attendance went up, Pentecostal churches, and the Church of the Lord attendance went up. Reason. During the Depression, people there were a lot of emotional people. The Pentecostal church grew because they could appeal to the emotions of the people. People generally wondered more about what does the Bible say about this or that, or many of them were wondering what does the Bible say about depression and all these dust clouds and so forth like that. And there were some radicals that had all the explanations. But some people were saying, what does the Bible really say about anything and everything? And the Church of the Lord was the one group that was saying, let's take what the Bible says. It doesn't matter what people think, but it does matter what the Bible says, because the Bible is the Word of God. And so the Lord's church grew during this time. Now, in most places, all churches combined, the general attendance was about 33% of their membership, which is very low. I decided, for your benefit, no, it was really for mine, to go through the songbook, Songs of Faith and Praise, which is used in many congregations today, and look at all the songs that were written during the 1930s, just in that one songbook. I have a list of this. I print almost everything on scrap paper, so that's what I do. I'm just going to give you a little sampling here. If anybody wants to see the whole thing, that's fine. Won't it be wonderful there? 1930. Won't it be wonderful there? This was written by a Christian. There are some songs that we sing all the time that were written by people in man-made churches and so forth. But anyway, let's see. In 1931, Wounded for Me. In 1932, Tillet S. Tedley. Remember him? Earth Holds No Treasures. Can you see a little bit of a trend here? Things are so bad, but we're looking for something better. One of the songs that I have never liked, written by Albert Brumley, some of you are acquainted with that name, I'll Fly Away.
I knew that's what you were going to say.
Every time, every Wednesday night, the boys in the congregation get up one by one and lead the same old song week after week. And this is one of them. I'll fly away. Every time a song is announced, I look at the bottom of the page. Who wrote it? When was it written? Who wrote the music? I look at all that before the song leader gets ready to start off on the first word. And I look down at the bottom of that, 1932. Such a good year. But I'll Fly Away was written that year. Worthy Art Thou. Teddy wrote that one also. In 1933, Jesus Hold My Hand by Albert Brumley. I first heard that song in 1947. I guess I was 15. No, I was almost 15 at the time. A boys' quartet. I was at Yosemite National Park at a young people's camp. They had an old people's camp there every year, but I went to a young people's camp. And 4 boys sang this song, and I thought that was the most beautiful song that I had ever heard. The boy that sang alto had one of the most beautiful alto voices I have ever heard, even till today. Sherry beat that, but that's beside me. 1935 was a great song, or a great year for songs. A New Creature, T.O. Chisholm wrote that, and L.O. Sanderson wrote the music. Those two combined for several songs in the years to follow. All Things Bright and Beautiful, L.O. Sanderson wrote the music to that one. Be With Me, Lord, Chisholm and Sanderson. Bring Christ Your Broken Life, Chisholm and Sanderson. I'll Never Forsake My Lord, written by a woman, but the music was written by L.O. Sanderson. My God and I was written in 1935. The Precious Book Divine was a poem that was written many years earlier, but it was arranged and the music was written by L.O. Sanderson. When I say that name, does that bring back memories? 1936, Cleanse Me, written to the music of a song, a Hawaiian song. And then in the 1940s, it became a popular song. Let's see, Now Is the Hour. Well, anyway, I'm reminiscing here. I'll meet you in the morning. With a what? Okay, that's another Bromley song. Wherever he leads, I'll go. Very good song. In 1937, Just a Little Talk with Jesus. When all of God's singers get home. One of Jeanette's cousins, that was his favorite song. And he finally went home. In 1938, Tandy wrote, "Oh, the depth and the riches. Precious Lord, take my hand," was written the same. Precious Memories, written that year. And in 1939, Peace in the Valley and Victory in Jesus. Again, notice the trend. Notice the kinds of songs that people wrote during bad times. This carried over in religion. I like music of all kinds, and so when I get the opportunity to talk about something like this, I do. So anyway, back to somebody might say more important things, not to me. Contributions decline. Well, that's normal. I don't think anybody would be surprised at that. Overall, 36%. In rural areas, even more. In the Southern Baptist Convention, contributions dropped 54%. The Methodist Episcopal Church dropped 75% in their mission efforts during the 1930s. Construction declined. That's natural. It was a time for storefront meeting houses. The first time I remember ever attending a worship service was in Kerman, California. And it was an old store building. Looking back on it, I would say that it was an old store building that was about to fall down. But that's where the church met. And I was totally ignorant of anything having to do with religion. But my mother decided it was about time to go back. She grew up as a Christian, or she grew up in a Christian family. And it was time to go back, and so I went with her. And I think that first time I was something like 12 years old. Storefront building. The Depression was a time of skepticism. Lots of skepticism. And raised depression and a dust storm and all this stuff raised all kinds of questions like, how could a loving God allow things like this? How could a loving God allow people all over the world to suffer? Questions like that always come up. Just recently I read this, I think this was Door to Door, House to House or something like that, whatever that publication is. There is a Professor Bart Ehrman from the University of North Carolina. He is the Distinguished Professor of Religious Studies. He is an self-avowed agnostic who claims that the pain and suffering he sees in the world makes it impossible for him to believe that the Christian God exists. Now that's a description that he gives of himself, and he is the professor of the distinguished James A. Gray, they always have to have all his name, Distinguished Professor of Religious Studies at a university. Well, that's not the 1930s, but I saw that and I thought, there are skeptics everywhere. But why put a skeptic teaching religion. Doesn't compute, but there are a lot of things that don't. Premillennialists during this time thought that the hard times were signs of the imminent return of Christ that would usher in 1,000 years of his reign on earth. Premillennialism as a very strongly taught theory continued very strong into the 1950s. I haven't heard much about it since that time. The Roman Catholic Church, still thought of in the United States as a foreign religion. It's one reason Hoover was able to defeat Alfred Smith in 1928. As late as 1962, when John F. Kennedy was elected President of the United States, there was still a lot of the idea that Roman Catholicism is a foreign religion. Anybody who is a Roman Catholic will do exactly what the Pope says. They don't know much about Americans. Americans are rebellious people. Americans are not going to be told by anybody what to do. And so, anyway, at that time I knew that John F. Kennedy was not going to be followed. I didn't vote for it, but that he would not be following the Pope, whatever the Pope said. The Catholic Church supported fascist rebels in the Spanish Civil War. Coughlin, the radio priest that we just talked about, was not only against Jews, but he was for all fascist regimes in Europe. Catholic opposition to communism is the only thing that can explain the ideas that the Roman Catholics had at that time. The church supported fascists. We talked about that. They opposed communism. And the picture that was up here before, this is Eugenio Pacelli. He later became Pope Pius XII. And those of us who lived through the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and so forth, we remember Pope Pius XII. Made a trip to the United States as Cardinal. 2 years after he came to the United States, Roosevelt sent a personal representative to the Vatican. A lot of people didn't like that at all. Priests were depicted in a good way in movies. Some of you remember this. Boys Town was one of the earliest movies that I saw. Not the first. The first one was The Wizard of Oz. First movie I ever saw. But at that time, the movie theaters showed reruns. This movie was made in 1938, but I saw it in about 1942. And they were still showing it years after that. So I don't know how many years after. And then, of course, there were some far out religious movements. One of them was George Baker. Any of you remember George Baker? Okay, let me ask that in a different way. Any of you remember Father Divine? Ooh, okay, not very many. I want to tell you about him then. Oh, he spelled it D-E-V-I-N-E, Father Divine. And there are a lot of people. I heard somebody recently in a song, when they used the word divine, which is D-I-V and so forth, pronounced it divine. And the word is used in some of our songbooks, and I listen every time we get to it, and I hear divine. Well, so maybe he wasn't so far off after all. But he got a large following, maybe 25 or 30 people, almost all women, in Valdosta, Georgia. That's where Jeanette grew up. In 1913, he was arrested for lunacy. That's the only thing they could think of to charge him with. He must be crazy. He's calling himself God. They tried him as John Doe because he wouldn't give his name. John Doe alias God. And he was represented free by J.B. Copeland. Any of you familiar with Valdosta know the Copeland name. It's everywhere. But he was told, never come back. That was his sentence. Leave Valdosta and never come back. So he went to New York. And by 1932, he had such a great following in Harlem. He was giving weekly free banquets. That was the thing he was noted for more than anything else. He loved to eat. And he would eat and share food with people. I want to show you his last house. One night, oh, by the way, he said that he would never die. His wife said he would never die. She was Mother Penny. He would never die. When he died, she said, oh, he's gone to heaven, and he's going to be there for a while. He'll come back. He'll come back. Eventually, she died. And I don't know how the movement went after that. But when I look at this house, I think of a song. Jerry, you know which one, don't you? No. I'm a skeptic. I don't think that way. I'm satisfied with, and so forth. You don't know that song? Don't sing it if you do. Oh. Now, we're going to go and eat in just a few minutes, but I want to at least get started on this subject of popular music. There's a handout titled Popular Songs. And do you still have your handouts? Yeah. Oh. Because I'm going to refer to one or two more before we're through with this. But the one that's titled Popular Songs, I got this list from a thing online. I printed it out on scrap paper. Of the 100 most popular songs in the 1930s. And I didn't want to list all of them, but before looking at some of them, I want you to notice the fact that Benny Goodman was known as the king of swing. The most popular music at that time was called swing. This was defined in Allen's book as hot jazz full of improvisation. Well, that's what jazz was even in the 1950s, in the 1960s, in the 1970s. Well, they quit calling it swing because you have to change the name or the titles for everything. Doesn't matter what it is. I'm not going to look around on this campus and see what's changed since I was here. But you have to change the names all the time. And so it's not swing anymore. Still jazz, but they have this kind of jazz and that kind of jazz and some other kind of jazz. And I can't keep up with all of it. I quit trying several years ago. It's just jazz to me. But some very good music. This was the time of the big bands, the so-called big band era. In this list of popular songs, Benny Goodman has several of them, but number one, notice, was In the Mood. In the Mood by Glenn Miller. In the 1930s, Bing Crosby became famous. October 29th, 1930. That's an anniversary, isn't it? 1 year after the Depression started, after the great crash that caused the Depression. Bing Crosby made his first recording. Now, remember his voice first. Remember. Think of it. Put it in your head. Beautiful, mellow baritone. Before his time, men singers were almost entirely tenor. And so he influenced away from tenor to baritone. I'm not going to call a lot of different names, but to emphasize or to illustrate the tenor, we all have heard Glenn Miller's orchestra over and over. One of the most famous singers for Glenn Miller was Ray Eberly. You remember him? Tenor. There were others that sang for it. Tenor. Oh, and this was changed by Bing Crosby. Now, one or two other things. Well, number 2 was God Bless America by Kate Smith. Do you remember that Kate Smith never had one music lesson in her life? You remember that? Kate Smith, beautiful voice, but not like, well, anyway. Did any of you look at the entire list yet? Look it over. You will not find This Land Is Your Land. You will not find, well, I'll not go back there. We'll stop here for lunch tomorrow. I want to mention several things about culture. I'm not through with music yet, but I want to say several things about culture in the United States, because there are some things I thought were interesting.
We'll be on the trip.
I didn't mean tomorrow.
Right.
If this were Friday and I was looking forward to Monday, I'd probably say, now tomorrow I want you to look. Thank you very much.